Hello and welcome to Tech Hub, an MSP-friendly how-to channel dedicated to Veeam-powered data protection solutions. My name is Brandon McCoy, and today I'm here to talk to you about leveraging immutable object storage with Veeam to enhance your backup and offsite strategies. We will take a look at what object storage is, how it is configured, and some of the best practices for leveraging object storage for data protection. Now in this video, we'll be focusing on Veeam Backup and Replication, but object storage works with quite a few of our other solutions. One last thing to note is that this video assumes version 12 of Backup and Replication, and all of the functionality and features listed are assuming that version, mainly in direct-to-object storage backup. So what is object storage anyway? Well, object storage is a storage system that manages and manipulates data as individual units called, well, objects. These objects are kept in a single storehouse and not ingrained inside files that are in other folders. Object storage instead combines pieces of data that make up a file, add it to metadata, and tops it off with a custom identifier. However, I'm a simple man, and I like to just think of object storage as a big bucket in the sky that you put stuff in. This bucket is extremely efficient in how it stores data, is cheaper than disk-based storage and hyperscalers, and has enhanced security features not found in most block and file storages. Now, although I did say a bucket in the sky, there are on-prem versions of object storage. So companies like Object First, Cloudian, Zadara, MinIO, and others offer appliances for on-prem object storage to support the same type of feature functionality. But for today's video, we're really going to be talking more specifically about the cloud versions of object storage, helping you achieve that 3-2-1 rule. Now, one last definition is immutability. What is immutability? Well, Webster defines immutable as not capable of or susceptible to change. And with your backups, that means they can't be deleted, modified, encrypted for the time that you specify. Now, although we're going to be talking about a few different object storage providers, and Veeam works with quite a few of them, keep in mind that some of them, such as Google at the time of this recording, do not support object lock with Veeam. And for the demo, we're only going to be focusing on Wasabi. So if we have the time, I may show you a few different features of different platforms like Azure, AWS, but for the most part, we're just going to be focusing on Wasabi. Now, there are some things to consider with using object storage. Immutability is the first one. We already talked about that. Another one is your storage classes. So while Wasabi and Backblaze only have one storage tier, other object storages like Azure, AWS have different classes. Now, these classes have different price points and different fees associated with them. For instance, Azure and AWS have your standard, your infrequent access, and your archive. AWS refers to this as S3 standard, infrequent access, and Glacier, while Azure refers to this as blob, cool, and archive. So the first tier is the most expensive price per gig, but the API costs are a lot smaller. And these API costs are, writing data, retrieving data, reading data. Some of these providers do charge for that. Now, again, something like a Wasabi or a Backblaze, they have a straight fee price per gig. I believe Backblaze has some very small egress fees. Wasabi has no additional fees other than it's $7 a month per terabyte, and I believe there is a minimum amount of time that you need to keep your backups there. But in terms of writing data, reading data, retrieving, restoring, no additional cost for that. So you have to really consider which kind of storage you want. Azure and AWS, if you're putting like 6-7 years worth of backups, maybe using the Glacier storage tier would make sense, and paying for that additional API cost on your dailies. Or maybe you're only keeping backups for like 3 months, 6 months, 30 days, and you think Wasabi or a Backblaze would be a better price than just choosing that one storage class. Now, you'll also need to consider your account privileges. In the demo today, we're going to be showing root users and sub-users in Wasabi. AWS, Azure have different terms for these, and again, we'll briefly touch on some of those. And then data flow. So this is something that is often overlooked. So when you're connecting to an object storage repository, how is that data being sent? Is it going straight from the Veeam server? Is it going through a specific VLAN? Maybe it's going to your data center first using Cloud Connect, or maybe it's going direct. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Now lastly, before we jump into the demo, what you'll need. So what you'll need obviously is an object storage account, so a Wasabi account, an Azure account, and we're going to be focusing again on sub-users, not using the root user of the account. API keys, also referred to as access keys. There's different ways to get these keys, and we'll try to touch on those with a few different providers. But again, we're really going to be focusing on Wasabi. And the only reason we're choosing Wasabi in this demo is because it's pretty simple to set it up, and it's a very popular option. Veeam does not recommend one over the other, and as we kind of previously talked about, they all have different use cases and pros and cons. You're going to select a region for your backups to be in. So this magical bucket in the sky is just a computer somewhere with storage. So you'll pick where your data would like to reside, and you'll have the appropriate permissions. And those permissions can be assigned to a user, or the user can be into a group that has permissions, or you can establish a specific role. So with that, let's jump right into the demo. So here we are inside Veeam Backup and Replication version 12. Keep in mind you will need at least the Enterprise Edition of the software in order to select object storage as a repository. The first thing I'm going to do is come to Backup Infrastructure. I'm going to select Backup Repositories and click Add Repository. The type is going to be Object Storage, and I'll be prompted to select the vendor or provider that I want to choose. Now S3 compatible, this is going to be the Backblazers of the world. There's also some additional ones. You can refer to these online. Any true S3 compatible object storage is supported. And then you've got the other ones whose name are listed. Now I'm not going to go through each one individually, but I do want to point out something that all of these have in common. All of these different object storage vendors have an access key and a service URL where the data is to be stored. Also, for most of them, except for Google, the immutability option is based on what we call versioning and object lock. So real quick, here in Azure, I've got a storage account, and this storage account has some specific blob services. Versioning is enabled, soft delete is enabled, and when I create a container, I'm able to select object lock. For AWS, I go to S3, I create a bucket, I choose the data center region, I make sure that versioning is enabled and object lock is enabled. Okay, so versioning, object lock, make sure you turn that on before you create your bucket. Also, make sure you're able to get your access key. So here I have my access key and my private key. Azure calls it a connection string, right? In Wasabi, there's going to be an access key and a shared key and a private key. Now for Wasabi and a few others, once you get that private key, you're not able to retrieve it again. So make sure that you put that somewhere safe. Okay, so let's go ahead and move through the demo using Wasabi. Okay, we're going to call this Veeam Tech Hub repo. I can limit the number of tasks or jobs going to that repository at once. I'm going to leave that alone. Okay, it's going to ask for the region. So it's also going to ask for credentials. So while we're here, let's go ahead and see what it needs. So region, credentials. Let's go to Wasabi. Now I am logged in as the root user. I would rather log in as a sub-user and create a bucket and an access key specific for that user so that I'm not sharing the same keys between different buckets and accounts. So I go to users, I'm going to create a user, and we'll call this Tech Hub. We'll give them API access as well as console access. We're going to create a password. Now this says require password reset, so your techs can create their own password. I'm going to disable this for now to save some time. Okay, search existing groups. I've created a group already called buckets, and I'm going to put them into that group. So this group could have all the correct permissions that it needs. The permissions that I'm going to choose here are Amazon S3 full access. Now, in the Help Center, you can see a list of all the permissions needed for us to back up to object storage. But just for ease of use, I'm going to select all S3 access here. I'm going to select Next, and I'm going to create that user. Okay? Now, let's get these access keys. So here's, whoops, I've got my access key and my secret key. Okay, I'll delete those after the video is over. And that is important, right? So these keys are how we access the bucket. Even if I do have access to these keys, I can't delete the backups in your Wasabi account. The only way that I could do that would be to blow away the root account. Hopefully your root account has multi-factor authentication. And again, I'm not using the root account for this particular bucket. Okay, so I got my keys stored somewhere safe. I'm going to log out as the root user, and I'm going to sign in as a sub-user. The sub-user is going to need either my email, or I can create an alias. They'll need to know what that alias is. That's the username. That's the password. So they're now signed in, and I'm going to create a new bucket. We'll call this bucket Tech Hub 321. Now these bucket names are globally unique, so if somebody else has created a bucket with the same name, you'll have to choose a different one. Select a region, so let's pick Texas US Central 1. Okay, now click Next, and again, bucket versioning and object lock. Right, so this has to be set before you create the bucket, and you can't go back after the fact. So if you want immutability, make sure those two things are checked. We'll click Next and create bucket. Okay, the bucket has been created. Let's go back to the Veeam software. For the region, we're going to change this to US Central-1. Okay, the credentials, I'm going to come in here and add my access key and my secret key, which I just added in just now. So for connection mode, this will allow me to choose a specific machine that the backups can go through to reach the internet. By default, the Veeam server is just going to push the backups directly to your object storage repository. Now you'll notice here it also says for self-managed agents, repository access control settings must be configured to enable direct access. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. This is going to be very important if you're offering your object storage through something like Cloud Connect. Okay, so if all that is correct, it should get me through the next screen here. Okay, now bucket, we should see the Tech Hub bucket that we just created. Okay, Tech Hub 321. Okay, folder, we're going to create a new folder, so we'll just have Veeam create that, and we'll call it Veeam Backups. Okay, click OK. Now I can limit the amount of object storage that can be sent. This is helpful if you want to limit your customer data. Keep in mind again that object storage is just infinity. There's no amount of storage you have to specify in your account, but you may want to limit your customer. Now here is where we make those backups immutable because of that object lock and versioning. Now 90 days is the max amount of time that you can specify for immutability in the GUI. There is a reg key edit that you can use to make that longer. Something that's important. Okay, it says GFS backups are made immutable for the entire duration of their retention. This is true if you are backing up directly to object storage. If you are using the capacity tier for a scale-out repository, the immutability is based on the number of days that you specify. And again, we're talking about direct-to-object storage. Typically, that is the preferred method. Scale-out repository adds additional layers of complexity that may not be needed if you're just trying to get a copy of your backup into object storage. Okay. The rest of these settings are just your regular repository settings, mount server for certain types of restores, and next, finish. So we're not going to go through the rest of that. We'll just keep going here. Okay, now under backup repositories, we can see my Tech Hub repository. One last thing I wanted to mention is if you're presenting this through Cloud Connect, then the customer's Veeam server is not going to be directly connected to the Wasabi bucket. If you're using standalone agents, the agents are not connected directly to that bucket, right? It's through your Cloud Connect server. So on your Cloud Connect server, on the Wasabi bucket, if you want your data to go direct from the customer site to Wasabi and not through your Cloud Connect server, you need to right click on the object storage repository, click access permissions, and make sure that agents share credentials to object storage direct to object storage. Thanks so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time.